Good evening. Tonight there is nothing to solve, nothing to remember, nothing that will be asked of you in the morning. Tonight we are going to talk about food. Ordinary food, in small cans, carried a long way by young men who were tired most of the time and hungry almost all of it. We are going to talk about a war, but not the way war is usually talked about. We are not going to talk about the fighting. We are going to talk about the long, slow hours in between, which is where most of a soldier's life actually happens. The waiting, the sitting, the unpacking of a cardboard box in the middle of the afternoon in heat that pressed down like a hand, and the small decisions that came out of that box. Which can to open first, which one to trade, which one to bury. This is a quiet story about a loud time. It moves slowly on purpose. There is no reason to keep up with it. If you fall asleep in the first 10 minutes, you have not missed anything, because there is nothing here to miss. The cans will still be there tomorrow night, and so will I. So put the phone down. Let your shoulders drop away from your ears. Let the room go dark around the edges. We are going to Vietnam, and we are going to look inside a box. Start with the box itself, because everything else comes out of it. It was cardboard, waxed on the outside, about the size of a thick book. It weighed a little over 2 pounds. Printed on the side, in plain block letters, was the phrase that gave the whole thing its official name: meal, combat, individual. Almost nobody called it that. The soldiers called them sea rations, sea rats, sometimes just rats, as in, we are on rats again, which was said the way you might say it, is raining again. The name was technically out of date. The true sea ration belonged to an earlier war and had been replaced on paper in the late 1950s, when the Army adopted this newer version with a longer and more official name. But names given by soldiers are more durable than names given by supply officers, and the old names simply refused to leave. 20 years later, in a different country, in a different climate, in a war the men who invented the phrase had never heard of, they were still called sea rations. You would receive them in cases. A case held 12 boxes, which is to say 12 meals, and a case weighed enough that you carried it against your chest with both arms, the way you carry something awkward and heavy for a short distance. The case would be broken open in the middle of a clearing, or on the back deck of a track, or on the wooden floor of a bunker, and then something happened that was almost a ritual. The boxes went face down, because each of the 12 boxes was a different meal, and because some of those meals were wonderful and some of them were not, and because everybody knew which was which, the fair method was to turn all the cartons upside down so that nobody could read the labels, and then let the men pick blind. Sometimes the cartons were mixed up first, shuffled around on the ground like a card trick. Sometimes the sergeant simply held the case and let each man reach in without looking. There were variations, unit to unit, but the principle was the same everywhere, and it was the principle that mattered. Nobody chose. Everybody drew. What you got, you got. And then, and this is the part that sounds strange until you have thought about it for a minute, you did not necessarily eat what you drew. You traded. The trading came after, and the trading was its own economy, with its own prices and its own unwritten rules. And we will get to that, because it is one of the most human things in this entire story. But first, open the box. Inside, the contents were packed tight, so they would not rattle. Rattling was a problem for reasons that had nothing to do with comfort, and we will come back to that too. There were cans, small, olive drab, unglamorous, with the contents stamped on the top in the same plain lettering as the carton. There was a main can, which the supply system called the M unit. That was the meat item. That was the thing you thought of as the meal, the hot part, the part with protein in it. There was a second can, the B unit, which was the bread and dessert side of the arrangement. Crackers, usually, some kind of spread, something sweet. There was often a third can, fruit, or a cake, depending on the menu. And there was a small brown packet, flat, about the size of a deck of cards, sealed at the edges. That was the accessory packet, and inside it was everything that was not food, but made food possible. We will open that one slowly, later, because it is a small museum all by itself. That was the architecture of a meal in the field. A can of something wet and warm, a can of something dry and crisp, a can of something sweet, and a packet of the small necessities of being alive. 3 of those boxes made a day. 3 cans of meat, 3 sets of crackers, 3 desserts, 3 little brown packets. Somewhere around 3,600 calories if you ate all of it, which almost nobody did all the time, because the heat killed appetite, and because some of it was not worth the effort, and because you were carrying it, and every ounce you did not eat was an ounce you had carried for nothing. Men lost weight in the field. That was normal. They came out of the bush thinner than they went in, and then they ate in the rear the way you eat when your body is trying to collect a debt. There were 12 menus, 12 possible boxes, 12 possible afternoons. Let us go through them the way you would go through them lying on your back in a hooch with the rain coming down on the roof. Not in a hurry, not in order of importance, just naming them. There was beefsteak, sliced, in juices. It came in a flat can, and it was well thought of. There was ham and eggs, chopped. That one divided people. Chopped ham and eggs in a can is not the same object as ham and eggs on a plate, and everybody knew that, and some men liked it anyway, particularly with hot sauce, particularly at 4 in the morning when nothing else was going to be warm. There was ham slices, cooked in juices, respectable. There was turkey loaf, which was closer to a slab than a slice, and which tasted more of the can than of the bird, but which had the advantage of being mild. There were beans with frankfurter chunks in tomato sauce, which is to say beans, and hot dogs, which every soldier in every army in every century would recognize instantly. Beanie weenies, popular, reliable. It heated well. It tasted like something a person might actually cook on purpose, and it did not fight you. There was spaghetti with meatballs in tomato sauce, also popular for the same reasons. There were meatballs with beans in tomato sauce, which was a near relative of the last 2. There was beef with spiced sauce. There was bone chicken, which was chicken in the way that canned chicken is chicken, paled and shredded and swimming, and which was quietly one of the most sought-after items in the case because it was mild, and because it could be turned into other things. There was chicken with noodles, which was a soup pretending to be a meal, and which was thin, and which nobody carried by choice on a long march, because it was mostly water, and you were already carrying water. There was pork slices, cooked in juices, and there was ham and lima beans. We are going to spend some time on ham and lima beans later, because it deserves it, but for now simply note the name, and note that a small silence has entered the room. Those were the 12. That was the whole world of possibility inside a case. If you were in the field for a month, you would eat every one of them several times. If you were in the field for a year, you would eat some of them dozens of times, and you would develop opinions about them that you would still hold. without changing them at all 40 and 50 years later. Men who could not remember the name of a village could tell you, without hesitating, exactly how they felt about the beans and franks. Food memory is like that. It goes into a part of the brain that does not renovate. Open the second can, the bread can. Inside were crackers, 4 of them, usually, round and pale and hard, stacked and wrapped, the kind of cracker that is designed for shelf life first and pleasure second. They were dry. They were extremely dry. They were dry in a way that made you understand, in your mouth, why the accessory packet contained what it contained. But a cracker is a platform, and what went on the cracker was where the B unit got interesting. There was cheese spread. Processed cheese in a small flat can, sometimes plain, sometimes made with pimento, sometimes made with caraway seed, and the cheese was one of the great successes of the entire system. It was fatty, it was salty, it stuck to the cracker, it survived heat, and it turned 4 bland discs into something you looked forward to. Men warmed the cheese can in the sun or over a flame until the contents went soft and spreadable, and then ate it with a plastic spoon straight from the can while sitting on their helmets. There was peanut butter, which was excellent for the same reasons, and which had a second life as a fuel, and a third life as an adhesive for other purposes we do not need to discuss. There was jam, apple, grape, mixed fruit, depending on the box. There was a candy disc, hard, sometimes chocolate-covered, sometimes not. There was cocoa beverage powder, which you were supposed to mix with water, and which many men ate dry with a spoon, like sugar, because mixing anything with warm iodized water was a decision you had to be in the mood for. And there was cake, pound cake in a can, fruit cake in a can, cinnamon nut roll in a can, a small, round, dense disk of cake, sealed with a shelf life measured in years, and completely, absurdly good under the circumstances. Pound cake in particular acquired a status that had very little to do with cake. It became currency. It became a gift. It became the thing you saved for the man who had done something for you, or the thing you handed to the new guy who had just discovered that he had drawn ham and lima beans on his second day in country. There is something worth pausing on there. In a place designed for scarcity and discomfort, the sweetest object in the box quietly became the local money, not because anyone decided it should be, because everybody wanted it. And then the fruit, applesauce, pears, fruit cocktail, peaches. Canned fruit in a hot climate is not a dessert. It is closer to a medical event. It was cold, if you were lucky, cool at least, and it was wet, and it was sweet, and after 10 or 12 hours of salt and grease and dust, it hit the body like a change in weather. Peaches were the prize. Peaches were the item. Sliced peaches in heavy syrup, and the syrup mattered as much as the fruit, because you drank the syrup afterward, straight from the can, tipping your head back, and for about 4 seconds you were not in Vietnam. The combination that became legendary, the one that veterans still describe with a specific expression on their faces, was peaches and pound cake. You opened the peaches. You opened the pound cake. You broke the cake into the syrup, or you spooned the peaches over the cake, and you ate it slowly with a white plastic spoon, sitting in the dirt, 20 years old, filthy, exhausted, and for the length of that can, it was genuinely, uncomplicatedly good. It cost nothing. It came out of a box that had been sitting in a warehouse for years, and it is one of the things men remembered most clearly for the rest of their lives. Now, the problem. All of this food was sealed inside metal, And the American soldier of that era did not carry a bulky opener, or a knife dedicated to the job, or anything you would recognize from a kitchen drawer. He carried a piece of stamped steel about 1.5 inches long, the P-38, a tiny folding can opener with a short blade that swung out on a rivet, a notch that caught the rim of the can, and a hole punched in one end so you could hang it on the chain with your identification tags. It weighed almost nothing. It cost almost nothing. It had no moving parts except the one, and that one was a fold. You hooked the notch on the rim, you rocked the little blade down into the lid, you walked it around the circumference in small bites, and the lid came up. It took maybe half a minute the first few times, and about 8 seconds once your hands had learned it, which they did quickly, because you were going to do this 3 times a day for a year. The Marines called it a John Wayne, which is an entire cultural argument compressed into 2 words. There are different explanations offered for why. It does not matter much which one is true. What matters is that this object, which the Army classified as a minor accessory and produced by the many millions, became one of the most loved pieces of equipment any American soldier has ever been issued. Men kept them after the war. They put them on keychains. They carried them for decades in a pocket, through office jobs and second marriages and the invention of the microwave, and they used them to open paint cans and pry batteries out of toys. And when they died, their children found them in a drawer and did not know what they were. That is a lot of weight for 1.5 inches of stamped steel. There is a lesson in it about design, if you want one, which is that the objects people love are almost never the impressive ones. But we are not here for lessons. We are here to sit with the small things, hang the opener back on the chain, let it click against the tags. Cold spaghetti with meatballs is edible, nobody will tell you otherwise, but warm spaghetti with meatballs in the rain on the 3rd day is a completely different experience, and the difference between those 2 experiences was worth a good deal of trouble. So the men made heat. The official method was the heat tab, a small compressed fuel bar made of trioxane issued for exactly this purpose. You broke it, you lit it, and it burned with a pale flame that was nearly invisible in daylight. It did the job. It was slow. It gave off a smell and a fume that men complained about, and it had the irritating quality of going out if you looked at it wrong. The unofficial method was better, and every soldier in Vietnam knew it, and it involved a block of plastic explosive. C4 is a stable compound. It does not detonate from fire. It requires a shock, a detonator, a specific and deliberate insult to do what it is designed to do. What it does when you simply set it alight is burn, fast and clean and extremely hot, and a pinch of it about the size of a marble would bring a canteen cup of water to a boil in well under a minute. So men pinched off pieces of demolition charge and cooked their lunch on it. There were rules, learned and repeated, and passed to every new arrival, and they were not optional. You never tried to put it out by stamping on it. The shock is the thing it is waiting for. You let it burn down, or you let it burn out, and you kept your face out of the smoke, and you did not do it inside an enclosed space, and you did not do it near the rest of the supply. Men were hurt learning these rules. That is how the rules got made. But on a wet afternoon, in a tree line, with a lump of C4 hissing under a canteen cup, and a can of beans and franks balanced on top, warm to the point where the fat went liquid and the smell came up, the arithmetic seemed reasonable to almost everyone. There was a 3rd method, and it was the most elegant, and it required nothing but garbage. You took an empty B-unit can, the short wide one. With the point of the opener, you punched a row of holes around the bottom edge for air, and you cut the top out. That was it. That was the stove. You set your heat source inside. You set your meal can on top, and the empty can did what a stove does, which is hold the fire in one place and hold the food above it. Men built these without thinking about it, the way you tie a shoe, and when they moved on, they crushed the little stove flat and buried it, because you buried everything, because a can left on the ground told anyone who came later that Americans had been here. How many, and when, and what unit, and how long ago. Rubbish is intelligence. You learned that early. Now the small brown packet. Tear the corner and let the contents fall out into your palm, and take them one at a time. Instant coffee in a foil sleeve, a single serving, freeze-dried, unremarkable by any modern standard, and completely essential. Coffee was the first thing in the morning, and the thing at 2 in the morning when you came off watch, and the ritual of making it was as valuable as the drink. Water into the canteen cup, heat under it, the powder in. The steam coming up into your face in air that was already too warm for steam to be pleasant, and drinking it anyway, because that is what you do. Cream substitute, a small white packet, which dissolved poorly and which everybody used anyway. Sugar in a paper sachet. Salt. 2 tablets of chewing gum, wrapped, the flat kind. Toilet paper in a small brown packet, folded flat. A modest number of sheets. Enough if you were careful, and men were careful, and men also traded for it, and men also received it from home in quantities that would embarrass a family shopping trip. A book of matches, treated to resist moisture, which, in that climate, was less a feature and more a hope. And cigarettes. 4 of them, in a little paper pack, sealed with the rest of the packet. The brands rotated. The cigarettes had been sitting in that box for as long as everything else in it had, which meant they were dry, which meant they burned fast and tasted like the inside of a warehouse, and men smoked them without complaint and traded them like small change. In the early 1970s, the cigarettes were removed from the packet, which tells you something about how the world was changing outside the war, but for most of the years we are talking about, they were simply there, 4 at a time, 3 times a day, in the food. That is the packet. Coffee, sugar, salt, gum, paper, fire, and tobacco. Everything a person needs to sit down for 10 minutes and feel briefly civilized. There is one more thing that belongs in this section, and it did not come from the army. It came from home in envelopes and shoeboxes, sent by mothers and wives and girlfriends who had received a letter saying, in careful, understated handwriting, that the food was fine, but that it could use something. Hot sauce. Small glass bottles of pepper sauce arrived in Vietnam by the tens of thousands, wrapped in socks so they would not break, and they transformed everything they touched. A can of ham and eggs, chopped, was one thing. A can of ham and eggs, chopped, with 6 drops of pepper sauce stirred through it, was another thing entirely, and the difference was so reliable that a man with a full bottle had a form of social power. The sauce company noticed. In the middle of the war, they produced a small cookbook, sized and packaged to fit in a ration can, and sent along with a bottle, full of instructions for combining the 12 menus into other dishes. Take this can and that can, add water, add sauce, heat, and you have something you can pretend is a recipe. Think about that for a moment, gently, without getting worked up about it. Somebody in a food company in Louisiana sat down and wrote recipes for men in a jungle, using only what those men would already be carrying. and then packed the book so it would survive the trip. It is a small kindness at industrial scale, and soldiers used it and improved on it, and passed the improvements around by word of mouth the way recipes have always traveled. That is how a system of 12 fixed menus turns into a cuisine. Not through the 12 menus, through the sauce and the combinations and the trading, which brings us to the market. Every unit had one. It had no location and no hours, and nothing was ever written down, and it operated within about 4 minutes of a case being opened. The rules were not written either, but they were consistent enough across the whole country that men who served years apart in different provinces described them the same way. Peaches were at the top. Peaches, fruit cocktail, pound cake, cinnamon nut roll. These were the currency. These moved. Cheese and crackers were solid. Beans and franks were solid. Spaghetti was solid. Beefsteak was good. Bone chicken had a premium among men who knew what to do with it, because it took on other flavors and could be stretched. Ham and eggs chopped was a matter of taste, and had a real market on both sides. Chicken with noodles was cheap, because it was thin, and because it was heavy for what it gave you. And at the bottom, at the absolute floor of the market, in a category by itself, was ham and lima beans. Men would trade 2 items for one to get out of it. Men would eat crackers and cocoa powder for a day, rather than open it. Men buried it unopened, which was a small crime against the supply system and a large mercy toward themselves. It became the standing joke of the entire war, the thing you gave to the new guy while everybody watched, the punishment issued in fun for losing a card game. The name the soldiers gave it cannot be said politely. It is 2 words. The first word is ham. You can work out the shape of the second from the fact that it rhymes with nothing you would say to a chaplain, and that every veteran who hears the first word will supply the second without being asked. Was it that bad? The honest answer is that it was probably not the worst thing in the case on the merits. Lima beans in a can, in fat, in a hot climate, congealing as they cool, are unpleasant in a particular texture-based way that some people find genuinely intolerable and others simply find dull. But the reputation grew larger than the food, and the reputation was funny, and the joke was shared, and in a place where very little was funny, and almost nothing was shared, a joke that everyone was in on had a value far beyond a can of beans. So the men kept the joke alive on purpose. That is what soldiers do with the small miseries. They give them a name, and once a thing has a name, it belongs to you instead of the other way around. Now let us talk about carrying it, because this is where the food stops being a meal and becomes a logistics problem, and logistics is the most soothing subject in all of military history. Nothing in the world will put you to sleep like a supply chain, and I mean that as a compliment. 3 meals a day in cans is a lot of metal. A man going out for 4 days needed 12 boxes. 12 boxes is more than 20 pounds before you have added a single round of ammunition, or a canteen, or a poncho liner, or the radio batteries somebody was going to make him carry because he was the youngest. So the men attacked the packaging. First, the carton went. You opened the box, you took out what was inside, and you threw the cardboard away, because cardboard is bulk, and cardboard turns to paste in the rain. Then the sorting. You looked at the cans, and you made a decision about each one, and the decisions were brutal and fast. This comes, this gets traded, this gets left. Nobody carried chicken with noodles on a long humping day if they could help it, because it was mostly liquid, and you were already carrying liquid, and liquid you can drink is worth more than liquid with noodles in it. Then the packing. The cans went into a sock. This is the detail that surprises people. An ordinary green wool sock filled with cans and knotted at the top, tied to the rucksack frame or stuffed inside. The sock did two things. It kept the cans together, and it kept them silent, because metal against metal is the loudest sound in a quiet place. A can knocking against a can carries a long way at night, in still air, and a long way at night in still air is exactly where a great deal of that war took place. So, the sock and tape, when there was tape, and a habit, learned in the first week, and never lost, of moving in a way that did not clink. There were men who could tell you, from 20 feet away in the dark, whether the man in front of them was carrying his cans properly. It was the sort of expertise that has no application anywhere else on earth, and was, for a year, a matter of professional pride. There was a lighter option, and for the men who needed it, it changed the arithmetic completely. It was called the food packet, long-range patrol. Soldiers called it the LRP ration or the LRP, which was already the nickname for the men themselves, so the food took the name of the eaters. It was freeze-dried. That was the whole idea. Take the water out at the factory, where water is cheap and heavy, and let the soldier put it back in the field, where water is heavy and expensive, but has to be carried anyway. A meal came in a foil pouch instead of a can. It weighed a fraction of what the equivalent wet ration weighed. You could carry several days of it and still stand up straight. The menus were plain, and there were 8 of them. Beef stew, beef hash, beef with rice, chicken with rice, chicken stew, chili con carne, spaghetti with meat sauce, pork with scalloped potatoes. You opened the top of the pouch, you poured in water, roughly 1.5 pints, you stirred it with the spoon, and then you waited, and the waiting was the price. Cold water took a long time and gave you an uneven result with hard bits in it. Hot water took a few minutes and gave you something close to a real meal. Men who were not allowed to make heat, because heat means smoke and light and smell, poured in cold water first thing in the morning, sealed the pouch, put it inside their shirt, and let their own body heat do the work over a couple of hours while they moved. That is either resourceful or grim, depending on your mood. It is certainly patient. Chili con carne was the favorite. Ask 10 men, and 8 will say chili. It rehydrated well. It had enough salt and spice to survive the process, and it tasted like a decision somebody had made rather than an accident. The pouch also came with the small comforts: a cereal or fruit bar, coffee, cream, sugar, toilet paper, matches, the same little civilization as the sea ration packet, translated into a lighter format. The catch, and it was a serious one, was water. A freeze-dried ration is a promise you make to your future self about water you have not found yet. In terrain where water was plentiful, this was a bargain. In terrain where it was not, a man could find himself with 3 days of food he could not eat, which is a very particular kind of hunger, and one that concentrates the mind. So let us talk about the water, slowly, because water is the true subject of every campaign that has ever been fought, and nobody ever writes about it. A man carried canteens. The standard one held a quart. There was also a larger, collapsible 2-quart bladder, which sloshed, and which you learned to pack full or pack empty, and never half. On a hot day in the field, a soldier might carry 4, 5, 6 quarts, and drink all of it, and want more. Water weighs a bit over 2 pounds a quart. 6 quarts is 13 pounds of water on a body that is already carrying everything else. And when it was gone, and you refilled from whatever was there: a stream, a bomb crater, a paddy, a well in a village, a hole in the ground with rainwater in it, which is why every man carried iodine, small bottles of purification tablets, issued and reissued and lost and traded. 2 tablets to a quart. Shake it. Wait. The waiting was the part everyone hated, because you are thirsty now, not in 30 minutes, and the water in your hand is already water. Then you drank it, and it tasted like a swimming pool that had been left out in the sun, and then had a coin dropped in it. Iodized water is one of the strongest sense memories the war left behind. Men describe it immediately, unprompted, decades later. The taste got into everything you made with it. It got into the coffee. It got into the cocoa. It got into the rehydrated chili con carne. There was no escaping it, because there was no other water. So the families back home solved it, the way families do, by mail. They sent drink powder, small paper packets of sweetened flavoring, the kind sold for children in every grocery store in America, grape and cherry and lemon lime, and those packets went into iodized canteen water and covered the taste almost completely. A packet of grape powder was worth real trade value in the field. Men wrote home asking for it specifically, and mothers sent it by the dozen, and it arrived crushed and leaking and perfect. There is something quietly moving about that if you let yourself sit with it. The world's most powerful military could put a man anywhere on earth within a day, and could not make his drinking water taste like anything but iodine, and the fix came in an envelope from Ohio. At the unit level, there was a better system. A large rubberized canvas bag hung from a tripod of poles or from a tree, with several small taps around the bottom. It was called a Lister bag. You filled it, you treated the whole bag at once, and men filled their canteens from the taps. In a base camp or a fire base, the Lister bag was a small social location, like a water cooler in an office, which is exactly what it was. And the water in it was warm, always warm. Everything was warm. Cold was a rumor from another country, which brings us to the helicopter, because for all the cans and all the powder and all the iodine, the Army had not forgotten that men who eat hot food fight better and complain less, and there was a whole apparatus devoted to getting hot food to men who were nowhere near a kitchen. The vehicle for this was a container called a mermite. It was a heavy insulated box with handles on the sides, and it held metal inserts stacked inside, and it worked on the same principle as a picnic cooler in reverse. Fill the inserts with hot food at the kitchen, seal it, fly it out. Open it 2 hours later at a fire base, and the food is still hot enough to matter. They were heavy. They were awkward. 2 men carried one walking sideways, ducking under rotor blades. They came in on resupply birds, along with the ammunition and the mail and the water cans, and they went back out on the same bird empty. And what came out of them was ordinary in a way that was completely extraordinary if you had been eating out of cans for 2 weeks. Scrambled eggs, sausage, bacon, bread, fried chicken, hamburger patties, mashed potatoes, gravy, real coffee made in a real urn in quantities. Men lined up with their mess kits or their canteen cups. The line moved. A cook or a volunteer served with a ladle. Nobody hurried the man in front of them. The soldiers called it hot A's from the Army's own naming of ration types. A rations were the fresh kind, made from real food with refrigeration behind them. B rations were the packaged and canned kind, cooked in a field kitchen without refrigeration. C rations were the individual sealed meals we have been carrying all night. The letters were a supply classification invisible to civilians, and the men used them as everyday speech. "We are on C's. We got hot A's this morning." It is the kind of vocabulary that only exists inside an institution, and it is one of the reasons veterans can recognize each other in 3 sentences. Hot chow did not arrive on a schedule. It arrived when it could. Weather stopped it. Contact stopped it. Priority stopped it, because a helicopter carrying eggs is a helicopter not carrying ammunition, and everybody understood which way that decision went. So it was never taken for granted. That is the thing about it. A tray of scrambled eggs at a fire base at 7 in the morning, eaten standing up in the mud with the smell of the burn barrel somewhere behind you, was received as a small event. Men remember specific breakfasts, not because the eggs were good, because they were eggs. In the rear, it was a different war. The large bases had mess halls with roofs and fans and long tables, and the food in them was, by the standards of institutional cooking anywhere in the world, entirely adequate. There were bakeries producing bread in quantity. There were refrigerated storage facilities. There were ships that arrived with frozen meat. There were, in some places, ice cream plants, and the ice cream from those plants was flown out to units in the field when the aircraft and the weather and the priorities all agreed, which was not often, and which is why the men who got it remember the day. The gap between the 2 experiences was enormous, and everybody knew it. A man could be eating cold ham and lima beans out of a can in the rain on Tuesday, and eating a hot meal on a tray with a choice of 2 desserts on Thursday, 60 miles away, in the same country, in the same uniform. This produced a certain amount of feeling. The men in the field had a whole vocabulary for the men in the rear, none of it flattering, all of it delivered with the specific bitterness of people who are wet talking about people who are dry. And the men in the rear knew it, and most of them had the decency to be a little embarrassed about it, and some of them had done their time in the field already, and had simply survived long enough to be given a job with a roof. It is not a moral story. It is a logistic story. An army is a pyramid, and only the top of it goes into the tree line, and the wide part underneath spends its days moving flour and diesel and mail. But the food is where the men felt the difference, because the food is where you feel everything. On the larger bases, there was also a store, the post exchange, the PX, a building, sometimes a very substantial building, where a soldier with money could buy things, and the shelves of it are worth walking along slowly because they tell you a great deal about what young men wanted in that decade. Cigarettes by the carton, cigars, candy bars in boxes rather than singly, soap and shaving cream and aftershave, film for cameras and cameras themselves, watches, radios, tape recorders, which were enormously popular because a tape recorder let a man send his actual voice home in an envelope and receive his mother's voice back, and there are families who still have those reels in a box in a closet. And food, of the kind that does not come in a case. Tinned snacks, nuts, cookies in packets, sweetened condensed milk, whatever had made it onto the shelf that month. The money was not quite money. Soldiers were paid in military payment certificates rather than in dollars, a separate currency printed for use inside the system, and the reason was to keep American cash from flooding the local economy and being traded at rates nobody in Washington had approved. Certain items were controlled and required a ration card punched at the register, so that a man could not buy 40 cartons of cigarettes at the low official price and sell 39 of them outside the gate at a considerable profit. He could still do it. He simply had to work harder at it. And the men in the field, who did not get to the PX for weeks at a time, gave lists to anyone who was going. Bring me back this. Bring me back 2 of those. Here is the money. The list system was informal, entirely trust-based, and it worked almost all of the time, because a man who let down the platoon on a PX run had to live with the platoon afterward. Then there was ice. Ice deserves its own moment, because in that climate it was closer to a precious metal than to frozen water. The large installations had plants that made it. Smaller places got it delivered when there was transport to spare, in blocks, packed in whatever would insulate it, and it began melting the moment it arrived. An ice run was an event. Men filled containers, filled footlockers, filled anything watertight, and buried cans of beer and soda in it, and stood there watching the ice do its work with an attentiveness usually reserved for cooking a steak. And when the drinks came out cold, actually cold for the first time in a month, grown men behaved like children about it, and nobody thought that was strange, and nobody does now. And then, twice a year, the system tried very hard. On Thanksgiving and on Christmas, the American military in Vietnam attempted, with real determination and considerable expense, to serve turkey to every man in the country. Think about what that requires. Frozen birds shipped across an ocean, cold storage that works in that heat, kitchens cooking through the night, mermite containers filled and loaded, helicopters flying to hilltops and fire bases and crossroads with hot dinner strapped in the back, in a country where flying anywhere was never routine. Turkey with gravy, stuffing, cranberry sauce, sweet potatoes, some kind of cake or pie. Menus of the period followed the pattern you would expect from a holiday dinner in the United States in that decade, because that was the entire point. The meal was not really about the food. The meal was a message delivered by aircraft that said someone knows what day it is. It did not always work. Men spent those holidays in places where nothing could land, and ate their turkey 4 days later out of a can, or not at all. Weather did what weather does, but it worked often enough that the holiday meal became one of the fixed memories of the war, and photographs from those 2 days every year show the same thing over and over in different provinces, in different years. A line of very young men with trays, in the mud, eating turkey. Some of them are smiling, some of them are not. It is the only day of the year the food arrived because of the calendar, and everyone understood that. There was also beer. The ration, where it could be delivered, was 2 cans a man a day. Sometimes beer, sometimes soda, sometimes a mixture, brought in on the same resupply runs as everything else, in cases, and distributed the same way. The brands were American and ordinary, names you would find in any refrigerator in any kitchen in the country they came from, which was, of course, exactly why they were sent. And it was warm, that has to be said clearly. Cold beer required ice, and ice required refrigeration, and refrigeration in the field was a fantasy. So the beer was the temperature of the air, and the air was 90-something degrees, and men drank it anyway with real pleasure at the end of a day, sitting on sandbags with their boots off. There were techniques for cooling it. Wet a sock, put the can inside, hang it where the wind moves. Evaporation does a little work. Bury the can in a stream, if there is a stream. Pack it in the middle of the ammunition where the metal has not been in the sun. None of these produced cold beer. They produced beer that was slightly less warm than it had been, and men performed them anyway, seriously, because the effort itself was part of the pleasure. In towns and around the bases, you could buy the local product, Vietnamese beer sold in bottles, with a number on the label that everybody learned to say, and various soft drinks in glass bottles that got recycled endlessly through the local economy. The soft drinks were often served over ice, and the ice was often made from water that had not been treated in any way at all. And this caused exactly the problems you would expect. And men kept buying it anyway, because it was cold and nothing else was. There was one more box in the supply chain that we have not opened, and it is a strange one because it was not food, and it arrived like food, and it worked on the same social logic, the sundry pack, the SP pack, a case issued to a group of men rather than to an individual, meant to cover roughly 100 men, and it contained the things a person runs out of. Cigarettes and cigars in cartons, pipe tobacco, candy bars and chewing gum in quantity, razor blades, shaving cream, toothpaste and toothbrushes, soap, writing paper and envelopes so a man could write home, playing cards. The SP pack came open in the middle of the unit and was divided by whatever method the sergeant preferred, and the division was watched closely because the contents were not evenly desirable and everyone had a preference. Non-smokers traded their cigarettes for candy. Card players traded soap for the deck. The writing paper went fast and then went slowly, because writing a letter takes a kind of energy that is not always available. It is a small window into how the war was supplied. Somewhere, a person had made a list of what 100 young men would need to remain functional for a period of days, and the list included tobacco, sugar, a clean face, and a way to tell your mother you were alive. That list is not wrong. And then there was mail. The single most powerful object in Vietnam was a cardboard box with your name on it in handwriting you recognized. What came inside was, on paper, absurd. Cookies that had turned into a single fused cookie mass in transit. Cakes that had aged badly. Canned goods that duplicated exactly what the Army was already providing. Socks, powdered drink mix, hot sauce, beef jerky, salami, which travels remarkably well and which arrived hard and dark and delicious, canned oysters and sardines, which some families sent for reasons known only to them, and which acquired cult status in certain units, instant soup, candy, chewing gum, more socks because mothers understood feet, and the food from home was never really about the food, which is why nobody minded that the cookies had fused. It was about the fact that somebody in a kitchen 8,000 miles away had spent an afternoon on you, that they had wrapped the bottle in a sock so it would not break, that they had written the address carefully because a smudge could send it somewhere else. Packages were shared, almost universally. A man who received a box opened it in front of the others, and it became the property of the group within about 90 seconds. And that was the custom, and men who did not follow the custom were noted, because the next box was somebody else's and it worked out, and because sharing food is the oldest thing people do. Everything else about that war was complicated. That part was not. Now let us cross over quietly and look at how the other army ate. This is not a political section. It is a food section, and hunger is not political. The North Vietnamese soldier and the Viet Cong fighter ate rice. Rice was the base, the constant, the thing everything else was measured against. A soldier's daily allowance was a fixed weight of it, and that weight was the difference between an army that could move and an army that could not, and the entire logistical effort of the other side was built around moving it south and keeping it dry. It was carried in a long cloth tube, sewn shut at both ends, filled with dry rice and worn over the shoulder and across the body like a bandolier or wound around the waist. It is one of the most practical pieces of equipment in the history of soldiering. It distributes weight around the torso. It does not rattle. It can be untied at any point along its length, and when it is empty, it is a piece of cloth that weighs nothing. With the rice went salt, which mattered more than anything, except the rice itself, because a person sweating for months in that heat without salt does not last. Dried fish, dried or salted vegetables, ground roasted rice, or corn as a marching food that could be eaten without cooking. Whatever could be grown, bought, requested, or gathered locally, which in some regions was a great deal, and in others was almost nothing. And when there was nothing, there was nothing. Diaries and memoirs from that side describe long stretches of real hunger, and describe the specific arithmetic of dividing a small amount of rice among a group of men day after day, and describe illness that came from months of eating one thing. The cooking was the interesting part, and it was solved with an invention worth knowing about. The problem was smoke. Fire makes smoke. Smoke rises, and rising smoke in daylight tells an aircraft exactly where you are. An army that had to cook every day and could not be seen cooking had a genuine engineering problem. The answer was a stove built into the earth, developed during the earlier war against the French and named for the cook who devised it. The firebox sits below ground level. Instead of a chimney, the smoke is drawn away through a series of channels dug horizontally through the soil, branching as they go, sometimes running under a stream bed or through wet ground, so that by the time it reaches the surface, it has cooled and dispersed and comes up as a thin haze through leaf litter over a wide area rather than a column from a single point. It was dug by hand, by tired men before they could eat, and it worked well enough to feed an army for years under an air campaign of a scale that had never existed before. 2 systems. One of them flies frozen turkeys to hilltops with helicopters. The other one digs a channel through wet clay so the smoke will not show. Both of them are trying to do the same thing, which is to get a hot meal to a young man who has been walking all day. The Americans also ate Vietnamese food, more than the popular memory allows. In towns, in markets, at stands beside the road, from vendors who set up outside every base, there was a whole cuisine available for a small amount of money, and a great many soldiers ate it and liked it and went looking for it. Noodle soup with beef, served in a bowl with herbs and a wedge of lime, rice with pork, grilled meat on skewers, bread rolls filled with meat and pickled vegetables, a direct inheritance from French colonial baking, married to local ingredients, sold on the street for pocket change, and fish sauce, which is the flavor that Americans either loved immediately or never made peace with. It is fermented. It is intensely savory. It smells like the sea in a way that is confrontational at first, and it is on everything. And half a century later, the men who liked it were the ones who came home and went looking for a Vietnamese restaurant in whatever city they landed in, and some of them are still doing it. There were also men who would not touch any of it for a year, out of caution or stubbornness or fear of getting sick, and who lived on cans and mess halls and the contents of packages from home. Both kinds of men existed in every unit. They sat next to each other. The caution was not unreasonable. Illness from food and water was constant, and was a real drain on strength across the whole force. But the trade was a real trade, because a bowl of hot noodle soup made by somebody's grandmother at a stand under a tarp is a better meal than anything that has ever come out of a can. and men knew it, and they took the risk with their eyes open. A word for the cooks, who almost never get one. Every large unit had them. They had a job classification and a specialty number like everybody else, and they worked in heat that would close a restaurant kitchen in any other country, over field ranges that ran on gasoline, producing food in quantity for men who would criticize it freely and eat all of it. They got up before everyone. They worked when everyone else was resting, because that is when meals happen. They dealt with a supply chain that delivered whatever it delivered rather than whatever they had planned for, and they improvised constantly. And the mark of a good field cook was the ability to do something interesting with the ingredient that had arrived in excess this week. They were also soldiers, and in a war with no fixed front line, a kitchen is not a safe place, and cooks stood watch and filled sandbags and were hurt and killed like everyone else. Nobody writes about them. There are no films about the mess sergeant. But if you ask a veteran about food, he will very often, within a minute or two, mention a specific cook, by name or by nickname, and describe something that man did with what he had. That is the memorial. It is oral, and it is real, and it lasts about as long as the men who carry it. The war ended in the way that wars end, which is to say, unevenly, and over several years, and not at the same moment for everybody. And the sea ration went on for a while longer, because supply systems have their own momentum, and there were warehouses full of them. Men in other places, in the years that followed, ate the same 12 menus and had the same opinions about the same lima beans and traded the same peaches and hung the same small stamped steel opener from the same chain. Then, at the start of the 1980s, the whole approach was replaced. The new system took what the long-range patrol ration had proved, which is that removing the water at the factory is the single biggest improvement available, and applied it across the board. Flexible pouches instead of cans. Lighter, no opener required. A different set of complaints, because there are always complaints, and men in the decades that followed produced a whole new folklore about a whole new set of menus, which is exactly what should happen. The cans went to surplus stores and to collectors and to the backs of garages. Some of them are still out there, sealed, decades past any sensible date, in the hands of people who open them on camera and taste them for an audience, and report that the crackers are still crackers, and the pound cake is somehow still cake. And the little opener went into pockets and stayed there. Let us take one ordinary day and walk through it slowly, from the first light to the last, and look only at the food. Nothing will happen in this day. That is the point of it. It begins before the sun, because everything began before the sun. In the last of the dark, every man is awake and in position, weapon in hand, watching the tree line, because the hour before dawn and the hour after dusk are the hours when things happen, and so those are the hours when nobody sleeps. This lasts until the light is up properly, and the world resolves into leaves and mud and other tired men. Then it is over, and nothing has happened, and the day begins with coffee. The canteen cup comes off the belt. This is worth describing on its own, because the canteen cup is the most useful object a soldier carried. It is a stainless steel cup with a folding handle, shaped so that the canteen sits inside it and the two ride together in one pouch. It is a cup. It is a cooking pot. It is a mixing bowl. It is a basin for shaving in, if a man is going to shave, which in the field he mostly is not. It is a measuring vessel for rehydrating a pouch of chili. It has no lid and does not need one. Water goes in the cup. Fire goes under the cup, the heat tab, or the pinch of explosive, or the little stove made from a punched can. The water takes a minute or two, and then it steams, and the coffee powder goes in and dissolves in a small brown cloud, and the sugar goes in, and the whitener that never quite dissolves, and a man sits on his helmet, or on his rucksack, or on the ground, and holds the cup with both hands, even though the morning is already warm, because holding a hot cup with both hands is something people do everywhere on earth, and nobody has ever needed a reason for it. Breakfast, if there is one, is whatever can he chose the night before. Ham and eggs, chopped, is the one that pretends to be breakfast, and so it is eaten in the morning by men who care about that sort of order. Others eat beans and franks at 7 in the morning without a flicker of hesitation, because the concept of breakfast food does not survive the second month. Then the day, whatever the day is, walking mostly, digging often, sitting and waiting more than anyone expects. Midday is the worst time for eating, because midday is the worst time for everything. The heat sits on the chest. Appetite disappears entirely. Men who have not eaten since dawn will pass up a meal at noon and not notice, and this is one of the ways the weight comes off. What gets consumed at midday is water, and more water, and a hard candy from the accessory packet, and sometimes crackers with peanut butter, because peanut butter does not require any enthusiasm. The good meal is the late one, somewhere in the afternoon when the column stops and the perimeter goes out and the digging is done. There is a stretch of time before dark that belongs to the men. That is when the cans come out properly. That is when the little stoves get built and the trading gets done, and the smell of warm tomato sauce moves through a position where 20 minutes ago there was nothing but sweat and dirt. It has to be finished before dark. All of it. Fire is light. Light is a location, and after last light, no flame of any size is acceptable. So the cooking happens in the last of the day, quickly, in a small window, and then everything is cleaned and buried, and the position goes silent and stays that way. At night, if a man is hungry, he eats cold. He works the opener around a lid in the dark by touch, slowly, keeping the sound down, and eats with a plastic spoon out of a can he cannot see, and knows what it is only by taste. Then he wraps the empty in something so it will not clink, and waits for his watch, and drinks warm water from a plastic canteen that tastes like iodine, and thinks about a kitchen somewhere with a refrigerator in it that hums. That is the day. There is nothing else in it. That is why the 10 minutes in the afternoon carried so much. We named the 12 meals earlier, quickly, the way you would read a list. Let us go back through them properly, slowly, the way a man would if you asked him at a reunion and he had all night. The beefsteak. It arrived as a slice, gray-brown, in its own juices, and the juices were the important part because they kept it from drying into leather. Warmed, with the fat gone soft, it was close to a real piece of meat, and it was the item most likely to be described afterward with the word decent, which in that context was high praise. Cold, it was firm, and the juices were a jelly, and men ate it that way too. The ham slices, cooked in juices, the same idea with a different animal, and a saltier result. Warmed with a little of the jam from the bread can, which sounds strange until you consider that ham with something sweet is a combination people pay money for in restaurants. It was one of the better things available. Somebody worked that out in the first year of the war, and it spread by word of mouth across the whole country, the way all of these discoveries spread. The chopped ham and eggs, pale, uniform, slightly grainy, and the object of a permanent argument. Warmed with pepper sauce, it was a serviceable breakfast. Cold, it was the thing most likely to make a new arrival put the can down and stare at it. Veterans in every unit made a point of eating it in front of the new men with obvious pleasure, partly because they had grown to like it, and partly because it was funny. The turkey loaf. Mild to the point of having almost no opinion about itself. It benefited more than any other item from hot sauce, from cheese, from anything with a personality. It was rarely hated and rarely wanted, which made it useful in trade as a kind of small change. The boned chicken, pale shredded chicken in broth, and one of the quiet stars of the case. On its own, it was nothing much. But chicken is a base. Add the cheese spread and stir it over heat, and you have something creamy. Add it to the chicken and noodles to give that thin soup some substance. Add rice, if anyone had rice, and now you are cooking rather than opening. The men who cared about food, and there were always a few in every unit, went looking for boned chicken specifically because it gave them room to work. The beans with frankfurter chunks in tomato sauce. Beanie weenies. If there was a consensus favorite in the entire 12, this was probably it. It was substantial, it was familiar, it heated beautifully, and it tasted the same as it would have tasted in a kitchen in Ohio, which was worth more than any culinary refinement. Men who received it in a blind draw did not trade it. The spaghetti with meatballs in tomato sauce, right behind the beans on almost every list. It came out of the can as a dense red mass, and it warmed into something that smelled briefly and powerfully like an Italian restaurant, and the smell did as much work as the food. The meatballs with beans in tomato sauce, the middle child of the tomato family, generally well regarded, generally traded at par. The beef with spiced sauce. Spiced is doing a lot of work in that name. It was mild by any civilian standard, and men added their own heat, but it had more character than the plain items, and was solidly in the upper half. The pork slices, cooked in juices, fatty, salty, better warm than cold, unremarkable, fine. The chicken with noodles, thin, watery, salty. As a hot drink on a cold, wet night in the Highlands, where it does get properly cold, and men do not expect it, this was suddenly not a bad thing to have. As a meal to carry on a long march in the flat heat, it was dead weight, and everybody treated it as such. The same can, valued completely differently depending on the weather and the terrain, which is a fair summary of how the whole system worked. And the ham and lima beans, the lowest rung, lima beans in a pale sauce with pieces of ham, which cooled into a paste and which had a texture that a certain number of people simply could not get past. It was the standing joke, the initiation, the loser's prize, the thing you found at the bottom of the case when everyone else had already picked. There is a small and slightly touching detail attached to it, which is that a minority of men genuinely liked it. There were always one or two, and in a unit where 11 men would not touch it, being the 12th man was a strong economic position, because he could take everyone's unwanted cans and charge for the service in peaches. Every economy produces a specialist. This one produced the man who eats the lima beans. Consider the can for a moment, since we have opened so many. It is small. It fits in a palm. It is olive drab, a green so specific and so institutional that seeing it anywhere else, on a locker or a truck or a filing cabinet, will pull a certain generation of men straight back to the ground under a tree in a country far away. Stamped into the lid is the identifying information. what is inside and when it was packed, and that date was frequently and famously a long time ago. Men opened cans that had been packed years before they arrived in Vietnam. This is not a scandal. It is simply how a strategic stockpile works. You produce large quantities, you store them, you rotate the stock, and what is issued today was made when today was still a plan. Soldiers noticed anyway, and made jokes about the dates, and passed around the ones with the oldest markings the way you would pass around a curiosity, and speculated about warehouses in places they had never been. And the food inside was fine. That is the part that would surprise a modern person raised on expiration anxiety. Sealed metal, sterilized contents, kept out of extreme heat, will hold for a very long time. The crackers stayed crisp, the cheese stayed cheese, the cake stayed cake. Only the cigarettes really suffered, going dry and papery, and men smoked them anyway. The empty can, once you were finished, was still useful for about 10 more minutes, as a stove, as a cup, as a small container for something you did not want loose in your pocket. And then it was garbage, and garbage was a problem. You buried them, not because anyone was thinking about the landscape, because a discarded can is a message left on the ground for whoever walks past next. An empty can tells a reader that Americans stopped here. The number of cans tells him how many. How dry they are tells him roughly when. The way they were opened, and what was left in them, and whether they were flattened, all of it is information. And there were people whose job it was to read exactly that kind of thing, and who were extremely good at it. So, the discipline was simple, and it was enforced. Cans went into a hole. Cardboard went into a hole, or was burned earlier in the day when smoke did not matter. Nothing bright stayed on the surface. Nothing that reflected sunlight was left where sunlight could reach it. When a unit moved off a position, the position was supposed to look, as far as possible, like nobody had spent the night there. In the base camps and the fire bases, where hiding was not the issue, the answer was fire. Waste was burned in barrels with diesel, and the smoke from those barrels is one of the smells that every single person who served there remembers and describes the same way, which is to say, with a wince. It was a thick, oily, sweetish smoke that got into clothing and stayed. Men who came home said that for months afterward, a whiff of diesel in a parking lot would put them right back on a hilltop. Then there was the wildlife, which had opinions about all of this. Rats came for the garbage and stayed for everything else, and in some base camps they were a genuine problem rather than a nuisance. Ants found food in seconds. A can left open on the ground for 10 minutes acquired a black moving edge. Men learned to close things, to hang things, to sleep with food inside the pack rather than beside it, and to check a boot before putting a foot in it, which is a piece of advice that has nothing to do with food, and which everybody in that country learned in the first week. Not everyone in that war was an infantryman walking through elephant grass, and the food changed shape depending on where a man sat. An armored crew ate better than a rifleman in the sense that they were not carrying anything on their backs. A tank, or a personnel carrier, is a vehicle with storage, and storage means cases of rations, extra water, a stove if somebody had scrounged one, and room for whatever the resupply brought. Crews also had a heat source that no infantryman had, which is an engine. Cans warmed on a hot exhaust or manifold while the vehicle ran, and by the time the column halted, dinner was ready, and no fire had been lit at all. That is a small piece of practical genius that turns up in every army that has ever had engines. The men on the rivers had it different again. The boats had a little storage, and sometimes a small galley arrangement, and the crews ate a mix of rations and whatever the nearest base could give them, and they had one advantage the infantry did not, which is that they were sitting on top of a large supply of water, though not water you would drink. The aviation units lived on the bases mostly, and flew back to them at the end of the day. A helicopter crew could eat breakfast in a mess hall, spend the day flying into places where men were living on cans, and be back for dinner under a roof. That contrast was noticed by everybody on both sides of it, and produced the same mixture of resentment and gratitude that it produces in every war. The men in the field wanted the aircraft, absolutely and urgently. They also had things to say about the people who got to sleep under a roof, and the two services, the Army and the Marines, ate the same rations from the same cases and told each other for the entire war that the other one had it easier. This argument has never been settled. It is not going to be settled tonight, and there is one more group that had to be fed, and that almost nobody thinks about: the dogs. Scout dog units worked with the infantry, walking at the front of a column with a handler, using a nose that could do things no piece of equipment in the inventory could do. Sentry dogs worked the wire at night on the big installations. There were several thousand of them in that country over the course of the war, and every one of them had to eat in the same heat, carried in on the same aircraft, out of the same supply chain. They were fed a proper ration made for dogs, shipped in like everything else, and the handlers fed them carefully, because a working dog that is off its food is a dog that is about to be sick, and a sick dog is a platoon walking without its best sensor. Heat was the enemy. A dog in that climate, working, wearing a coat it cannot take off, needs an enormous amount of water, and the handler carried that water in addition to his own, which meant he was the man in the column with the heaviest load and the least excuse. Handlers shaded their dogs during halts. They checked paws. They rested them when the ground was too hot to stand on. And, of course, they supplemented the ration constantly against instructions, because a man who spends every hour of every day with an animal is going to share his lunch with it. The dogs learned the sound of the opener, the same way every dog everywhere learns the sound of a tin being opened, and a scout dog that heard that small metallic ratcheting noise would come around and sit down and wait with an expression that has not changed in 10,000 years of this arrangement between the two species. Some of the men still get quiet when the dogs come up in conversation. Not all of the dogs came home. That is as much as we will say about it tonight. A short section, and a quiet one, about the things that arrived with the food, but were not food. Salt tablets were issued and were taken seriously, because men were losing salt at a rate that is genuinely difficult to imagine if you have not worked in that kind of heat. The doctrine on how many and how often changed over time as understanding improved, but for most of the war there were salt tablets around, in bottles, at the water point, handed out with a warning to drink plenty. Then there was the malaria tablet. Malaria was a serious drain on the force, and the prevention was chemical, and the chemistry was taken on a schedule. There was a large tablet given weekly, and units generally administered it on the same day every week, so that nobody had to remember anything. And Monday was the traditional day, which produced its own vocabulary. Men called it the Monday pill. It was well known for what it did to the stomach. A significant number of men who took it spent the next day paying for it, and this created the predictable problem. which is that soldiers began to quietly not take it. So it was often administered in front of somebody, at a meal, hand to mouth, watched. There is something faintly parental about the image, a sergeant standing at the end of a chow line, making sure 20 grown men swallow their medicine, and it was necessary, and it was resented, and it saved a great many people from a fever that would have taken them out of action for weeks. Stomach trouble in general was constant. It came from the water, from the food, from the heat, from the tablets, from the local ice, from the sheer difficulty of keeping anything clean. It was so common that it stopped being remarkable and became just another feature of the day, like sweat. Nobody puts this in films. But if you want to know what daily life was actually like, this is a bigger part of it than most of what does get filmed. And then, for the ones who came home, there was the last part of the story, which happened in an airport or a base cafeteria or a kitchen in a small town, and which almost every one of them describes. The first meal. Men had been imagining it for months. They had discussed it in detail, at night, in the dark, in the specific and slightly obsessive way that hungry people discuss food. What they would eat first, where, in what order. These conversations were a genuine institution, and they were as much about home as about eating, because when a man describes the exact hamburger he wants, he is really describing the place where that hamburger is. The two things named most often were milk and steak. Milk, because fresh cold milk was almost impossible in that climate, and what was available was reconstituted and served at a temperature that milk should never be. Men fantasized about a cold glass of milk with a specificity that sounds comical until you have been very hot for a very long time, and when they got home, a great many of them drank milk first, standing at a refrigerator before anything else. And steak, for the obvious reason, which is that it is the opposite of a can. There is a small and consistent postscript. A lot of men found that the first big meal did not go well. A stomach that has spent a year on rations and heat and low appetite does not take kindly to being handed everything it asked for at once. So the great homecoming feast frequently ended with a young man lying down feeling terrible, having eaten his way straight into a lesson about moderation that he had not expected to learn on that particular day. Then it settled, and life went on, and the food of that year receded into the background where it belonged, except that it did not entirely. Some men could not touch lima beans again, ever in any form, for the rest of their lives, and their families learned not to serve them. Some men kept eating canned peaches deliberately well into old age because they liked them and because of what they were attached to. Some kept the little steel opener on a keychain through 4 decades and 3 jobs. Some went looking for Vietnamese restaurants the moment one opened in their town, and sat down and ordered noodle soup, and did not fully explain to anyone why. Taste and smell are wired into memory more directly than sight or sound. That is not sentiment, it is anatomy, which means the food of a year is not stored the way the facts of a year are stored. It stays available and it comes back whole, and it comes back without asking permission, usually over something trivial in a supermarket aisle 40 years later. Here is a thought to fall asleep to. Every single can we have talked about tonight made a journey of many thousands of miles through at least 4 separate handling systems to arrive in the hand of a specific tired person at a specific moment. And the whole apparatus existed to deliver, at the far end of it, 4 crackers and a tin of cheese. It started in a factory. Somewhere in the United States, in an ordinary industrial building with a parking lot, Machines filled cans with beans and franks and sealed them and cooked them under pressure to sterilize the contents. Then the cans were coated and labeled and packed 12 to a case, and the cases went onto pallets, and the pallets went into a warehouse, and there they sat, sometimes for years in the dark, waiting for a war that had not been announced yet. When the war came, the pallets moved to a port and went onto a ship. The crossing took weeks. A cargo ship carrying rations is one of the least dramatic objects in military history and one of the most decisive. Nothing about the war worked without it. Everything that anyone ate, wore, fired, or drove had come across that ocean in the hold of a vessel like that, slowly, at the speed of a ship, which is a speed that has not changed very much in 100 years. Then the ships arrived, and in the early years that was its own problem, because a country that had not been built for this suddenly had to receive it. Deep water ports were few. Piers were few. Ships waited offshore for their turn to unload, sometimes for a long time, and cargo came ashore on smaller craft, and the whole system had to be enlarged in a hurry while it was already running. Engineers built piers and dredged harbors and put up warehouses on sand, and within a few years there were port and depot complexes on that coast handling a volume of freight that would have been respectable for a mid-sized American city. From the port, the cases went to depots, from the depots to base camps by truck, in convoys, on roads that had to be cleared every single morning before anything could move on them, because a road left alone overnight is not a road you can trust in the morning. There were men whose entire war was driving those convoys, and they had a hard time of it, and they are another group nobody writes about. From the base camp, the cases went out to the field, and the last leg was almost always by air. A logistics helicopter came out on a regular run, and men called it the Logbird, and it brought everything at once: ammunition, water in plastic cans, mail, replacement parts, batteries, rations, sometimes the insulated containers with hot food. It landed in a clearing or hovered over a hilltop, while men wrestled cargo out of the door in a hurricane of rotor wash and red dust. And then it lifted away, and the sound faded, and the position went quiet again. Or the load came in underneath, in a cargo net slung below the aircraft, swinging gently, lowered onto the ground by a pilot who could not see it and was being talked down by a man on the ground with his arms up. That was the last 100 feet of a journey of 10,000 miles. And then a 19-year-old picked up a cardboard box, turned it upside down so nobody could read the label, and held it out to the man next to him. There is something worth resting on in that: the scale of the machine at the top and the smallness of the thing at the bottom. Ships, ports, depots, convoys, aircraft, and at the end of it, a hand reaching into a case, and a small green can, and 4 crackers. Every army that has ever existed is that shape. Almost nobody notices, because the interesting part is the fighting, and the fighting is a tiny fraction of the time. The rest of it is moving cans. Watch a position grow over weeks, and you can measure it entirely in food. On the first day, there is nothing. A patch of ground on a hill, chosen because it can see in several directions, cleared by engineers in a day of noise and dust. The men who arrive that day eat cans, cold, sitting in the open, because there is not yet anywhere to sit, and nothing yet to cook on, and no time. By the end of the first week there are holes in the ground, and sandbags around them, and a routine, and men have started to build the small stoves and heat their meals in the late afternoon. There is a water point of some kind. There is a place where garbage goes. By the second or third week, if the position is staying, a tent goes up, and inside the tent is a field range that runs on gasoline and a cook. Now the position can heat food in quantity. Not fresh food, not yet. Canned and packaged food, prepared for a group, which the Army classified with its own letter, and which nobody outside the system has ever heard of. It is not a restaurant, but it is hot, and it is served on a tray or into a mess kit, and it is not a can you opened yourself, which turns out to matter enormously. By the second month, if the position is permanent, there is a proper mess arrangement with a roof and a floor and refrigeration of some sort, and the resupply is bringing fresh eggs and meat, and there are 2 hot meals a day and a third for the men coming off patrol, and there is coffee available all the time from an urn, and the men who were there on the first day, eating a cold can in the dust, now stand in a line with a tray and complain about the eggs. That is not ingratitude. That is exactly how human beings work, and any sergeant will confirm it. And there is something comforting about the reliability of it. The standard rises to meet whatever is available, and then the complaints resume at the new altitude. A man who would have wept for hot coffee 3 weeks ago now says with total sincerity that the coffee here is terrible. The reverse also happened, and happened often, because positions were abandoned as well as built. A unit would move and the tent would come down, and the range would be lifted out under a helicopter, and the men would go back to cans on the ground, and they would remember the eggs fondly within about a day and a half. Now the recipes, which is the most cheerful part of this whole story, because men did not simply eat what was in the can, they combined, and out of 12 fixed menus and a few accessories, an entire informal cuisine grew, taught by demonstration, never written down except by that one sauce company, and different in its details from unit to unit. The simplest one first: cheese on crackers, warmed. Take the flat can of cheese spread, set it near the heat until the contents soften, spread it on the 4 crackers with the handle of the plastic spoon. That is it. That is the most eaten dish of the entire war, and it takes 90 seconds. Then the improvement. Crumble the crackers into a can of the thin chicken and noodles, and stir, and let it sit. The crackers absorb the broth and swell, and the soup becomes a stew, and the worst can in the case becomes a filling meal. This trick was known everywhere. Then the sweet one. Peaches over pound cake, which we have mentioned, and which deserves its reputation. Some men broke the cake into the peach can and mashed it into the syrup. Others kept them separate and alternated. There were opinions on this, held firmly. Then the drink, cocoa powder and coffee powder, together in 1 cup of hot water, which produces a rough field version of what a coffee shop would now charge you $5 for, and give a foreign name too. Men who discovered this thought they had invented something, and they had, independently, several thousand times. Then the whole meal. Beans and franks with the meat from a can of ham slices cut in, hot sauce through it, crackers crumbled on top for texture, heated properly, and eaten out of the can with a spoon. That is not a joke meal. That is a genuinely good plate of food that happens to be assembled from military stores in the dirt. There were more elaborate ones. Men made something close to a sandwich by using the flat crackers as bread and the meat item as the filling, with cheese and sauce. And it is not a sandwich in any legal sense, but it works. Men made a kind of hash out of the potato item and the pork. Men who had access to local rice, and there was often local rice, added it to everything, because rice makes any wet canned meat into a proper meal, and this is a discovery humans have made in every century. And the sweetened drink powder from home turned up in unexpected places, into water, obviously, but also stirred into the fruit syrup, or used to make the cocoa less flat, or simply eaten from the packet on a march by men who wanted the sugar and could not be bothered with the water. The pattern in all of this is worth noticing gently before you drift off. Nobody ordered any of it. No manual described it. It came from bored, hungry, resourceful young people with limited materials and unlimited time, teaching each other, and it improved steadily for years. That is how every folk cuisine on earth has ever been produced. It just usually takes a village a century, and this one took a war a few months, and almost every unit had one man who was better at it than the rest. Not the assigned cook, somebody in the squad, a rifleman who had worked in a kitchen before he was drafted, or whose family ran a restaurant, or who simply cared more than everybody else did, and who could look at 4 unwanted cans and turn them into something that people asked for by name. He was not given the job. He drifted into it, the way the man who is good with a radio drifts into carrying the radio. Men saved their trade goods for him and handed over the cans without being asked, and he did the assembling, and everybody ate a little better on the days he had the time and the ingredients. It bought him a specific kind of standing, not rank, something older than rank. In any group of people living rough, whoever handles the food ends up holding a position that no organizational chart can create, and it lasts exactly as long as he keeps doing it well. There is a version of that man in every crew of every ship, in every mining camp, in every expedition that has ever gone anywhere difficult. He is one of the oldest characters we have, and in this particular war he was usually about 20 years old, from somewhere with a small population, and he did his best work sitting in red dust with a plastic spoon and a lump of burning explosive, feeding 8 tired people out of cans that had been sitting in a warehouse since before any of them enlisted. Nobody wrote his name down, but if you ask the men who ate his food, they remember him first, before the officers, before almost anybody. The food also flowed the other way, out of the bases and into the country. Around every American installation there grew a local economy, immediately and inevitably. Vendors set up at the gates and along the roads, selling drinks and food and souvenirs. Women took in laundry. Barbers cut hair. Children sold whatever could be carried and knew every soldier's name within a week. And American goods leaked outward into that economy in enormous quantity. Cigarettes, obviously, soap and razor blades, and toothpaste from the sundry packs, and rations in cases by the truckload in some places, which found their way into local markets and were sold openly, sometimes within sight of the base they had come from. Some of this was theft on a large scale, organized and profitable, and there were investigations and prosecutions and a permanent low-level war between the supply system and the people quietly draining it. But a great deal of it was smaller and more human than that. A man gave a can of peaches to a child at the gate. A unit passing through a village handed out crackers and cheese because the crackers and cheese were there, and the children were there, and the men were 20 years old. Somebody's mother sent so much candy that it had to go somewhere. The line between generosity and leakage was not clean, and it was crossed constantly in both directions by people who were not thinking in those terms at all. The result was that American ration cans became part of the everyday material a Vietnamese life for a period of years. They were used as containers, as cups, as lamps, as building material. Flattened cans became roofing and siding in poor neighborhoods, and there are photographs of houses built substantially from the packaging of an army. And the Vietnamese cooked with what was in them and had opinions about it, and by every account the opinions were mixed in about the same proportion as the American ones. The cheese was strange, the peaches were good, the lima beans were a puzzle. Before the sounds, the smells, because smell is the sense that filed all of this away and never gave it back. Tomato sauce warming in a can over a small flame, which is a domestic smell, a kitchen smell, arriving in a place with no kitchen in it, and which is probably the single most powerful food memory the whole war produced. Instant coffee in a steel cup, which does not smell like coffee from a machine and never has, and which men would recognize instantly today if you put it under their noses. Wet canvas, wet cotton, wet leather. Everything was wet for months at a time, and everything smelled of it. Gun oil, on hands, on clothing, on the spoon if you were careless, faintly on the food. Insect repellent, which came in a small plastic bottle which men called bug juice, and which had a sharp chemical smell that got onto the fingers and then into whatever those fingers touched. Many a can of peaches in that war tasted very slightly of repellent and was eaten anyway. The oily, sweet smoke of the burn barrels, which we have already mentioned, and which every single person there mentions. Diesel and dust and hot metal off a vehicle that has been running. Rain arriving on dry ground, which is one of the good ones, and which was frequently the only good one available that day. And from the villages, carried on the air, cooking, charcoal, garlic, fish sauce, rice steam, something frying, the smell of ordinary people making ordinary dinner a few 100 meters away, going about the evening the way people have gone about the evening in that valley for 1,000 years, while a group of foreign teenagers sat in a hole eating out of tins and smelled it and said nothing. Now the sounds, since you may be close to sleep now, and sound is the last sense to go. The sound of a case being opened, cardboard tearing along a seam, 12 boxes shifting against each other, the sound of the opener working a lid, a series of small, quick bites, metal on metal, going around a circle. Once you have heard it, you can identify it forever. The soft hiss of the heat source under a canteen cup, and the different, hotter hiss of the other kind that we do not officially recommend. Water beginning to move in a steel cup before it boils, which is a sound that arrives before any bubbles do. A plastic spoon against the inside of a can, scraping the last of the sauce out of the bottom, tipped up, angled. One man doing this, while another waits for the can he is going to be given. The pop of a beer can with a pull tab, warm, at the end of the day, on sandbags. The rotor beat coming in with the resupply, growing from nothing over a couple of minutes until it is the only thing in the world. Then dust, then shouting, then the beat receding again, and the enormous silence afterward. The rain on a poncho, which is a sound like static, under which men ate an unknown number of meals, with their heads down and their shoulders hunched. And at night, the deliberate quiet. Nothing rattling, no metal on metal anywhere. Cans wrapped in socks and stowed. A man chewing slowly in the dark, because chewing quietly is a skill, and he has learned it. That is the soundtrack. There is no music in it. There never was. There is a particular conversation that happened in that country every night for years, in bunkers and on watch and lying in the dark waiting to sleep. And it was always the same conversation, and nobody ever got tired of it. "What are you going to eat first?" It was asked seriously. It was answered in detail. Men described the restaurant, the street it was on, what they would order after that, whether they would sit inside or outside. A man from a small town would describe a diner that 4 other men had never heard of, and would describe it so well that they could see it. Somebody would object to a detail. Somebody would defend his choice of hamburger against a rival hamburger from a rival state. This went on for hours and cost nothing, and was one of the most reliable pleasures available. What they named was almost never exotic. Nobody in a foxhole dreams about a tasting menu. They named cold milk, and a hamburger, and a steak, and their mother's roast, and pie, and ice cream, and a Coca-Cola with actual ice in it, poured over the ice so that it hurts your teeth. Cold was the theme running under all of it. Not richness, temperature. In a place where everything a man drank had been sitting in the sun, cold became the luxury item, and it stayed the luxury item for the rest of some of their lives. And then there were the letters home which asked for very specific things, and which families answered with an enthusiasm that occasionally overwhelmed the postal system. Hot sauce, constantly. Drink powder, in quantity. Beef jerky and dried sausage because they survive. Canned oysters, canned sardines, canned anything unusual, because the novelty was the point, and the 10th flavor of anything in a year of eating 12 things is worth more than its calories. Homemade cookies, understood on both ends to be arriving in fragments. Instant soup and bouillon cubes, which turned a canteen cup of iodized water into something warm and salty that tasted like an idea of home. Chewing gum and hard candy because they last in a pocket. And socks, always socks. The letters asked for food, and the mothers sent food and socks every time without being asked, because a mother knows that a boy walking all day in wet boots is a boy with ruined feet, and because sending socks is a way of touching someone from 8,000 miles away. Before we finish, let us count the case out once more, slowly, the way you might count sheep, except that these are cans, and they are real, and every one of them was carried by somebody. Beefsteak. Ham slices, cooked in juices, ham and eggs chopped, turkey loaf, boned chicken, chicken with noodles, beans with frankfurter chunks in tomato sauce, meatballs with beans in tomato sauce, spaghetti with meatballs in tomato sauce, beef with spiced sauce, pork slices cooked in juices, and ham and lima beans at the bottom where it belongs and where somebody will eat it anyway. Now the bread can. 4 crackers, hard and pale. Cheese spread, plain or with pimento or with caraway. Peanut butter, jam, a candy disc, cocoa powder, pound cake, fruit cake, cinnamon nut roll, white bread in a tin. Now the fruit, applesauce, pears, fruit cocktail, sliced peaches in heavy syrup, and the syrup. Now the packet, instant coffee, cream substitute, sugar, salt, 2 tablets of gum, toilet paper, folded flat. Matches that resist moisture in theory. 4 cigarettes, until the year they were taken out. And the opener, an 1.5 inches of stamped steel, hanging on a chain against a young man's chest, going up and down with his breathing while he sleeps. That is the whole world. That is everything a soldier in that war had to look forward to, 3 times a day, for 365 days. And out of that short list, they built trades and jokes and recipes and rituals and an entire private language that half a century later they can still speak with each other in a parking lot after a reunion. One more picture, and then we will stop. Late afternoon, on a hilltop. The light is going amber. The digging is finished. The perimeter is set. The logbird comes in from the east, and everyone hears it a long way out. It settles into the cleared space in a storm of red dust that gets into eyes and mouths and every open can, and men run in low and drag off water cans and ammunition and a mailbag and 2 insulated containers that are heavier than they look. The aircraft lifts, noses over, and is gone in 15 seconds, and the dust hangs there and then settles, and the sound goes down the valley and fades, and the quiet comes back in like water filling a hole. And then somebody opens the containers. Inside is hot food, not much of it, and not fancy, and it has been in there 2 hours. Fried chicken, maybe, potatoes, bread, something sweet at the bottom. The line forms without anyone giving an order. Nobody pushes. The men who were out on the listening post get served first, because that is the custom. Somebody produces the good hot sauce, and it goes down the line hand to hand, and comes back at the end, mostly empty, and nobody says anything about it. They eat standing up, in the last of the light, with their weapons leaning against their legs. Then the containers are stacked to go back on tomorrow's bird, and the mess is buried, and the sun goes, and the position turns quiet and dark and watchful for another night. That is the 10 minutes. That is what all the ships and ports and depots and aircraft were for. There is one more list, and it is the shortest way to understand the whole year, and it is made entirely of absences. There was never anything fresh, nothing crisp, nothing that had been alive that week. A leaf of lettuce was a rumor. A raw tomato was a story somebody told. An apple, cold, with the skin on, was the sort of thing men described to each other, the way sailors used to describe islands. There was never anything cold. We have said this already tonight, and it is worth saying once more, because it is the absence that men mention first, and the one that lasted longest in memory. Everything was the temperature of the air, and the air was the temperature of a closed car in a parking lot in July. There was never an egg cooked the way you like it. There were eggs sometimes in quantity, scrambled in a pan the size of a table 2 hours before you got them. That is not the same thing, and everyone knew it. There was never bread that was baked that morning within 100 miles of where you were standing, unless you were in the rear. And if you were in the rear, you were not really in the part of the war we have been describing. There was no plate. There was a can, or a metal tray, or a mess kit, and a plastic spoon, and the spoon was the only utensil, and you did not need any other. There was no table. There was the ground, a sandbag, a helmet turned over, an ammunition crate, the tailgate of something, your own knees. There was no chair. There was almost never a chair. Think about how much of your own life is spent in a chair, and then take all the chairs away for a year. There was no napkin, no glass, no ice, no salt shaker, no menu, no choice, no privacy, and no evening where the meal was the point of the evening, rather than a pause inside a working day that had begun in the dark and would end in the dark. And there was no certainty about when the next one would come, or whether it would be hot, or whether the weather would allow it. And that low background uncertainty is the part that is hardest to convey to anybody who has not lived it. It is not dramatic. It is just always there, sitting behind everything, like a low sound you stop noticing and never actually stop hearing. Which is why the small things counted for so much. The can of peaches, the trade, the cheese warmed until it went soft, the cup held in both hands. When almost everything has been removed, whatever is left becomes enormous, and men who had almost nothing found a surprising amount of pleasure inside a very small space. That is not a moral. It is just what happened, and it happens to people in every difficult place, and it is one of the more decent things about our species. So that is the food. It was not good, most of it. It was not meant to be good. It was meant to be shelf-stable in a hot climate for years, to survive being dropped from an aircraft, to be eaten cold if necessary by a person who was too tired to care, and to deliver enough calories to keep a 20-year-old body walking under 60 pounds of equipment. Judged against that list, it was a considerable achievement. Judged as dinner, it was a can of lima beans in fat. But that is not really what any of this was about. What it was about was the 10 minutes, the sitting down, the rain on the poncho, the little stove made from a can that was garbage a minute ago, the 4 crackers and the cheese, the syrup drunk straight from the can with your head tipped back, the trade you made and the man you made it with, and the fact that he gave you the pound cake because you gave him the peaches last week, and neither of you had to mention it. Armies run on that, not on the calories, on the 10 minutes. The men who were there are old now, the ones who are still here. They will tell you they cannot remember the name of a place they spent 3 months, and they will tell you, without pausing, exactly which meal they would trade for, and exactly which one they would bury, and their hands will move a little while they say it, doing something small and precise, the shape of working an opener around the rim of a can. That is enough for tonight. If you are still awake, there is nothing left to stay awake for. The case is empty. The cardboard has been thrown away. The trades have all been made, and everybody got something they can live with, which is the most any of this ever offered. Somewhere on a hillside a long time ago, a young man finished a can of peaches, drank the syrup out of the bottom of it with his head tipped back, and then put the empty can in a hole and covered it over so that nobody would know he had been there. He is old now, or he is gone. The hole filled in on its own. The hill is green again, and there is nothing on it. But the can is still down there somewhere under the grass, with the lid folded back the way he left it. The fire is out, the cans are buried, the sock is packed, so nothing rattles. Sleep well. I will be here again tomorrow night, with something else that takes a long time to say.